This is NC Spin, an unrehearsed discussion on issues of interest to North Carolinians. Now, here is your moderator, Tom Campbell.
Welcome. You've heard and read the spin the media and the politicians have put on the issues of the day. To get the correct spin on what's going on in North Carolina, let's introduce you to our panel of experts. They include the John Locke Foundation's Becki Gray, Syndicated columnist and author John Hood, Chris Fitzsimon from NC Policy Watch, and former House Speaker Joe Mavretic. Well, this show promises to be very interesting as we ask our panel to look ahead to the short session of the legislature that will convene April 25th, and we assess new President, UNC President Margaret Spelling's first few weeks on the job, along with the controversy regarding admissions she's facing. We'll also examine the new DHHS proposal for Medicaid reforms and ask the panel to tell us something we don't know. Let's get started. In 3 weeks, our legislature will return to Raleigh for the so-called short session. In addition to reviewing and revising the second year of the state's 2-year budget, they'll be considering other issues, and we want our panel to preview some of them. John Hood, let's start with the basics. Recent press releases indicate our state revenues are running well ahead of projections, and the state should have a surplus by the end of the June 30 fiscal year. Just how strong are these revenues, and what does it tell us about our state economy?
Well, revenues are running, I would say, modestly above projections, certainly significantly above last year. I believe that state tax and non-tax general fund revenues together are up about 6% over last year. Again, slightly above the projection, but certainly above last year. The real story here is expenditures are very controlled, modest. There's even been a net decline over last year in some categories of spending, for example, in Health and Human Services. Enrollment growth is not as large in universities, community colleges, and some schools as expected. And so spending is such versus revenue that we're running a cash surplus through February, from July to February, of almost $500 million. Now, that doesn't tell us necessarily what the surplus will look like in June, because we've got the big April 15th tax deadline and quarterly withholdings and so forth, and there are some expenditures that are lumpy. But right now it looks like a pretty healthy surplus going into the next fiscal year. Chris,
let's dovetail on that. Assuming that $500 million surplus at the end of the year comes to reality, a lot of people are asking how they're going to spend that, and probably the first place that they're going is state teachers and state employees' pay raises. What are you hearing on that?
Well, the only problem with that is that I don't think it'll be that big at the end of the year, but even if it is, that's one-time money that's a surplus. You can't spend one-time money, or you shouldn't, on recurring salary increases.
No, we're not talking about money that reverts back to the state. We're talking about revenue growth that's annual versus expenditure. So some of that will be recurring.
Yeah, but they're going to project a new revenue growth for next year.
Yes, but what I'm saying is some of that growth is recurring, and you can spend it for multiple years.
Well, the word, and I don't have the best sources among the Republican leadership, but I keep hearing that we're talking about a 2 to 3% pay increase is what they want to do. We'll be interested for teachers and state employees. It'll be interesting to see if they can do that. There's still a lot of pressure just to continue to target teacher salary raises. This will be I think the defining issue of the session really is how much they do for teachers. Despite the rhetoric, there are a lot of veteran teachers that have barely gotten a raise at all in the last few years.
Always try to give state employees a pay raise on election years, don't you, Joe?
Absolutely, but I got to tell you that after 15 years in the General Assembly, I learned never to talk about money availability until the 12th of May. And I think anybody who makes forecasts about how much money we're going to have violates that law.
All right, Becki, Senator Bob Rucho, who is retiring at the end of this year, has been hinting we're going to see some more tax cuts.
You'll always hear that from Bob Rucho.
Well, what is he proposing?
Well, I think he would like to further expand the sales tax base, and of course he wants to tamp down on the personal income rate. So expand the sales tax to more services and perhaps lower the personal income tax, although personal income tax has just been lowered again, so I think they need to be cautious in how far they go with this. But a couple other things that I'm hearing is to increase the zero tax bracket, perhaps some reform to capital gains, perhaps some differences in the way that costs are expensed rather than deducted, so changes like that.
John, we're hearing a lot of small businesses are mounting an effort to get the legislature to restore that $50,000 deduction that they had previously had for the first $50,000 in profits at the end of the year. What are you hearing on that?
That was a very poor tax policy. It was a 2-year policy. It was enacted in 2011. It was a temporary measure. It was the worst possible way to cut taxes is to exempt a certain amount of initial dollars. It's exactly the opposite of supply-side tax cut. And that was income that was being taxed once rather than corporate income that was being taxed 2 or 3 times. So that was the wrong way to cut taxes. I don't think they'll restore it. But small businesses do have legitimate gripes, particularly if the sales tax base is expanded further and forces businesses into being tax collectors.
But many of these small businesses are what's called subchapter S corporations, correct, which means that the profits
which means that they were being taxed once rather than corporate income from C corps.
No, they're taxed by the individuals that own them.
That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
They're taxed once as the individual rate, whereas money going through a C corp is taxed 2 or 3 times.
Right.
That's why that was the wrong policy. Cutting taxes is a good idea. That was not the right way to do it.
Tom, let me jump in here on a theme that I think we need to keep in front of us on NC Spin. Republicans want to increase the sales tax base and decrease the income.
Change the mix of where the
state's
getting
mix.
Revenue.
That's the strategy in the long run. And so when we see the moves on the checkerboard, we ought to understand why those moves are being made.
All right, Becki, one of the things that you have been a very vocal opponent or an advocate for is this NC range, trying to reduce the number of regulatory agencies and regulations in state government. What do you think is going to happen with that?
I think they're going to take a good close look at it. There's a couple things that are going on. First of all, Tom, think about it this way. Every rule, every regulation has a cost associated with it. And so we talk about taxes, we talk about the laws that are put into place, but these rules are very oppressive and have a real impact on the economic recovery. So it's something that the General Assembly needs to look at and pay attention to. This REINS Act that you talk about is a provision that would be put into place that for every rule that has a major financial impact, not every little tiny thing that goes on, that would be, just unworkable, but for a large financial impact of $10 million over 5 years, that the legislature would have a look at that before it actually goes into play, so that there's a little bit of oversight in the rules, and to begin to, again, rein in the control of unelected officials putting all these rules and regulations in place.
Chris, what are you hearing about some other things that might come up in this short session? Well, typically, they like to come into session and get out pretty early.
Yeah, I think I mentioned last week on NC Spin the one education issue, this achievement school district issue, which was very controversial. It was bandied about behind the scenes and never really introduced last session. I think that a version of that will definitely be introduced this session. It's very controversial. There's another proposal called innovation zones or innovation school zones, which some more progressive people like more. That's going to be combined with achievement school districts. It'll be interesting to see how many votes that gets. I think that'll be an interesting issue.
And John, some people are suggesting the legislature might even weigh in on this core curriculum issue that the
Common Core.
Yeah, Common Core. I'm sorry, core curriculum, Common Core, that the State Board of Education is now dealing with. What do you think on that?
It's possible. There was some disappointment among some lawmakers that the Common Core State Standards Commission that was created didn't have a specific recommendation. We'll have to see what DPI does with the recommendations and then how the legislature responds.
Well, here's a reminder. There's much more on our website, ncspin.com or ncspin on Facebook. You'll find video, image not seen, or footage not seen anywhere else, perspective pieces from our panel, and our weekly column. Get more balanced debate from the Old North State on ncspin.com or ncspin on Facebook or on Twitter at ncspin tweets. Easy for me to say. After the break, we're going to consider UNC President Margaret Spelling's first few weeks.
NC Spin will return after these messages.
Baseball players from other countries are considered guest workers here. Baseball, the previous administration and Congress cut a deal in 2006 allowing foreign players to travel freely across the country. Not so for agriculture guest workers. They're vilified for doing work Americans won't, and they face a mountain of red tape just to get here. Shouldn't American agriculture get the same consideration as baseball? Farm Bureau and Agriculture, we keep North Carolina growing.
1 in 5 North Carolinians can't buy healthy foods in their communities, increasing their risk of obesity, diabetes, heart disease, stroke, and some forms of cancer. It's time to invest in the Healthy Corner Store initiative. Visit ncallianceforhealth.org to learn more.
We now return to NC Spin.
Margaret Spellings has begun her new job as president of the UNC system by conducting a listening tour at the various campuses. She's repeated her theme of affordability, accessibility, and accountability at each appearance, but she's been met with some student and some faculty protest, and perhaps her first controversy over NC Gap, a program designed to so that students who attend community colleges and earn an associate's degree will automatically be admitted to a UNC school. Joe, most of the people that I've talked with seem very impressed with Spellings, even those who didn't like the process by which she was named. I want to talk more about NC Gap, but I want you to assess her first few weeks as president.
Well, I think she's doing exactly what a good CEO ought to do. She's visiting her businesses around the state. I applaud her thick skin. I think she's handled the adversarial meetings very well. I think she has handled her critics in a very diplomatic way. I like her style. I think what she's saying is right on target. Whether or not she can convince the legislature to increase more money to the university system, I think is up in the air. But the legislature owns the university system, and I think she
reports directly to the legislature.
Absolutely, and I think she's doing a good job.
Chris, there are a number of challenges our UNC system faces. We mentioned last week, particularly at Elizabeth City State University and some of the historically black universities, enrollments are down pretty dramatically, which of course creates problems within their budgets. Are there any other problems that you know of that she might be facing right off?
Well, I think there is there have been continuous discretionary cuts in the budget of the UNC system. There's pressure again to raise tuition. I think she has done the right thing by going around and talking to folks, but I think her real test is going to come this legislative session when she walks in the door and asks for increase for specific campuses, for specific budgets, and see how the General Assembly treats her. And also, there's a lot of leftover animosity between the Board of Governors, that is actually her boss, and the legislative leadership, who were initially not happy that she was chosen.
That's a much bigger issue than most people think.
That's right, and so she really has walked into a hornet's nest. She's done a good job going to campuses and listening, but that's just the beginning of her orientation to the way North Carolina politics is currently running.
John, this affordability issue she talks about so much, you talked about on the show recently the difference in cost and price.
Yes.
Tuition cost, regardless of whatever else may be going on to economize within the UNC system, are going up. What do you think she can do to actually reduce the cost of education?
Well, that's the point. It's not about making somebody else pay. A lot of people focus on, well, let's make college cost less by making other people pay. That doesn't make it cost less. That just changes who writes checks. If you want to make college cost less, you have to change staffing, use technology, reduce the number of students who come into the system and then don't complete degrees. You have to make a lot of decisions. And we talked about that guaranteed admission program, GAP. That was designed for students who applied at some of the UNC schools, and under the admission standards that these schools really need to enforce, they don't quite make it. So they go to a community college for a couple of years and come back in. There was a report from the UNC system. There was a lot of pushback on the idea, and I don't want to get into a lot of the details, but the bottom line is that historically black institutions and UNC Pembroke stood to lose. They were already having trouble with enrollment. And frankly, some of them would like to reduce the admission standards in order to fill their seats. This would have the effect of transferring some of the students into the community colleges. They couldn't stand for it.
Well, but the legislature,
is worth noting.
I'm sorry?
It's worth noting that President Spellings also did not support NC Gap.
But the legislature passed that program.
What is actually happening is some in the legislature want it to go ahead and be implemented immediately, and the report that the UNC system produced and the one that Spellings referred to actually said, let's hold off for a couple of years and see what happens. There's not really implacable opposition to it. There's some disagreement about the effects. Here's the basic problem. You take a kid in to a university, she's not prepared to succeed. She's 2.5 years in and she drops out. If she was at a community college, she would have gotten an associate's degree, then gone to the four-year institution and maybe not make it. She would have something. Sending her to a university and 2.5 years later drop out, she has nothing to show for it. That's a big problem.
Okay, and here's the other part of that, Tom. Anytime you get to a university policy issue and people want to muddy the water, the first thing you say is diversity and the historically black universities, and now the water is muddied.
All right, let's get back to the issue, Becki, that Chris raised, because I think it's a very valid one. The previous Board of Governors obviously fired Tom Ross. Now, they handpicked Margaret Spellings. Do you think relationships between the BOG and the president are going to be better? Or you think there's still going to be a controversy?
Well, I think it's up to Margaret Spelling, and I think that, as Joe mentioned, I think she's off to a great start. I think that she's a great representative. The controversy between the North Carolina GAP program, the community colleges like it, they're ready to go with it. The universities, as John mentioned, just want to pull back and make sure that they're doing it right. But the other things that she's doing is she's looking at performance pay. I think the assumption that she's going to go into the General Assembly and start demanding money is unrealistic. She is looking to spend that money better. She talks about putting in place the right structure with the right people to get the right results.
Well, Erskine Bowles said those same things, if you remember, and found that fighting the bureaucracy was very tough.
And, you know, if anybody can do it, I think Margaret Spellings can do it.
And Erskine was dealing with Democrats.
So, but it was a Democratic board.
I'm saying Erskine was dealing with Democrats. She's not, and that's the difference.
She's also making friends, I think, within the universities, within the faculty, in that she's going in and she's involving them in the challenges, listening. She's going all across the state, holding a lot of these listening tours, if you will, but she's really involving the faculty and the universities in these challenges. How do we fix it? What do we do? So she's gaining a lot of buy-in.
People I talk to say she's a very active listener. John, how long a honeymoon is she going to have before people are going to start expecting some sort of results?
It's going to be a bit of a honeymoon. I don't think she's going to be in any immediate challenge, immediate problems.
All right, after these messages, we're going to talk about Medicaid reforms.
NC Spin will return after these messages.
I help educate and inspire visually impaired students to strive for a brighter future.
I make sure visitors to the North Carolina Zoo take a walk on the wild side.
And I make sure that the fuel you buy is a quality product from pipeline to pump.
I support small businesses in North Carolina by matching them with hard-working, well-trained employees.
I make sure the roads you drive on are safe.
Scenic, the one voice speaking in support of the men and women who are making North Carolina great.
It's a fact, patients who receive care in the medical home from a trusted family physician reduce healthcare costs through prevention, early detection, and affordable management of high-cost chronic diseases.
Every dollar invested in healthcare matters. Let's invest them wisely, building on North Carolina's medical home model. Better health begins with a medical home, a trusted family physician, the best return on our healthcare investment. Learn about the importance of medical homes at OurNCHealthcare.com.
1 in 5 North Carolinians can't buy healthy foods in their communities, increasing their risk of obesity, diabetes, heart disease, stroke, and some forms of cancer. It's time to invest in the Healthy Corner Store initiative. Visit ncallianceforhealth.org to learn more.
You sleep on concrete till your body get immune to concrete.
My mom got my brother and I up and said, "Come on, we're leaving."
I became homeless in the beginning of this year.
When I was about 4 or 5 years old, our house caught fire.
I used to see my brother. If he see me, he'd turn and go the other direction.
We did the only thing that we could think of, and we went to a Salvation Army shelter.
You know, we don't have this, like, what's your background look like? We just say, what do you need?
I remember the man from the Salvation Army coming down with a box of clothes.
The Salvation Army officer bought my brother and I an ice cream cone.
Last week, my brother walked up to me, and he just started a conversation.
Today I've given my life to the Salvation Army because I remember what somebody did for me, my brother, and my mom over 30 years ago.
The Salvation Army for me means hope.
Compassion.
Family.
Support.
We now return to NC Spin.
If you've watched NC Spin over recent months, you know we've talked a lot about Medicaid and specifically about Medicaid reform. Well, one of the main goals of the legislation passed last year was to ensure budget predictability by instituting what's called capitation, which is paying a certain sum of money per month per recipient to either an insurance company or a provider-led entity. DHS Secretary Rick Bezier and Medicaid head Dave Richard recently presented the plan for implementing these reforms to a legislative oversight committee. Becki, the reaction from the lawmakers, providers, and the public seems positive at this time. Tell us how you think these new reforms are going to work.
Well, so far so good. I mean, actually, you know, in this committee, one of the announcements that was made is that Medicaid actually has $185 million ahead of their budget. So that was very good news.
For like the second year in a row?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And, you know, particularly after years and years of huge shortfalls, and the budget predictability part of it has been so troublesome for so many people. And there was a report that was due by March 1st to the General Assembly, which is the report that you're talking about. It was a very aggressive schedule that the General Assembly set out to put all this stuff in place. So just the fact that they had the report, they had all their ducks in a row, and gave a very comprehensive report to the General Assembly says a lot. In the meantime, what DHHS has been doing is putting into place, they're making plans for these 6 different regions that are going to manage Medicaid, putting stuff in place for at least 4 of the plans that will be available to those Medicaid patients in those regions. The big news, though, is getting the federal waivers to be able to go forward with these reforms. And they're getting all of that in order to present that. I believe it's this summer in June that they'll actually put those waivers in place. So we're 3 or 4.
Well, that's when they make the application to get these waivers in place.
So, you know, we're still a ways away. All of this stuff takes place. And as you know, when you deal with the federal government, and since Medicaid is 2/3 federal funding, we have to get the federal government's permission to do all this stuff. So it's complicated, it's very cumbersome, it takes a while. But in answer to your question, it seems like so far things are going quite well.
That's a short answer.
A long answer to, yeah.
Okay. Chris, as far as it goes, dovetailing on Becki, 6 regions throughout the state in which there will be provider-led entities who can provide this Medicaid service. And there will be 3 statewide managed care organizations, typically commercial insurance companies or people of that ilk. This is a real hybrid system. It is a little bit unusual from the standpoint of what the feds normally approve. How much trouble do you think they're going to have getting this approved?
Well, I don't know. It'd be interesting to see. I mean, I think actually, despite I think some of the talk about the federal government, they've been relatively flexible in approving some Medicaid expansion plans and some Medicaid changes in individual states. I think it's worth noting that when Becki says there's a $180 million surplus in the Medicaid plan, that wasn't because of reform. Reform hadn't started yet. So all the talk about cost overruns, Nelson Dollar, for example, will tell you that a lot of these reasons we have cost overruns this year is because we've repaid penalties over the years. We've had things that have come due. We finally paid those. We are doing a better job managing the program, but a lot of this surplus is because we've paid off things that we owed for making mistakes in the past. The program is actually running okay now, and remember, that's before reforms take over.
So this is pre-reform. John, the state's going to establish this per patient per month fee to provide care. I think the big question in everybody's mind is what happens if the actual cost of care exceeds the fees that are being provided. Now, we know that there are going to be contracts that are supposed to be issued, but how long is, for instance, an insurance company going to put up with losing large sums of money?
Well, we don't have to guess at this. A number of states already have systems like this. And if you want to know the answer, you know, which way does it go? It depends on the state. It depends on the situation. There have been states that have multiple Medicaid contractors doing some sort of capitation system. The cost came in over budget, and some of those providers dropped out. In other states, you've had competitive markets. You had multiple providers. The cost came in higher, and the providers actually figured out a way to save costs in the next year.
Joe, anytime we raise the subject of Medicaid, the topic of Medicaid expansion comes up, and there are a lot of people who want to see us expand the roles of Medicaid in North Carolina. What do you see is the appetite for that with the legislature?
Well, I hope they don't have an appetite for it, and I use the example of the interstate highway system, where we built the system, but the maintenance of the system in perpetuity belongs to the state. Bad deal.
All right. After this messages, we're going to ask the panel to tell us something we don't know.
NC Spin is brought to you in part by the North Carolina Farm Bureau, The Farm Bureau and Agriculture. We keep North Carolina growing.
The cost of everything has gone up dramatically over the last 75 years. With one exception, keeping electricity affordable. That's the power of your co-op membership. Learn more at togetherwesave.com.
North Carolina's Touchstone Energy Cooperatives, looking out for you.
Baseball players from other countries are considered guest workers here. Baseball, the previous administration and Congress cut a deal in 2006 allowing foreign players to travel freely across the country. Not so for agriculture guest workers. They're vilified for doing work Americans won't, and they face a mountain of red tape just to get here. Shouldn't American agriculture get the same consideration as baseball? Farm Bureau and Agriculture, we keep North Carolina growing.
Now we come to one of our favorite parts of the show when we ask the panelists to tell us something we don't know. Chris Fitzsimon, I'll start with you.
One of the few areas of bipartisan agreement in the last few years has been the efforts to look at the crazy laws we have for ex-offenders that keep them out of the workplace and end up making them more likely to go to prison. We've made a lot of progress. I hope that this short session, some of those efforts will continue, and we'll try to have more sane sentencing policies in North Carolina.
Tell us something we don't know, Joe Mavretic.
The Declaration of Independence was well named independent. In North Carolina, we call people who don't agree with either the major parties unaffiliated, which is certainly a negative term. I would hope that the Board of Elections in North Carolina would come around to recognizing that people who want to see both sides and what the best offer is would be called independent rather than unaffiliated.
Interesting. Becki Gray, tell us something we don't know.
Tom, there's something new and growing in healthcare in North Carolina called direct primary care. And this is where a physician opens a practice and practices medicine. Patients have access 24/7 to that. There's no insurance involved in exchange for a small monthly fee. This is gaining popularity in North Carolina. A lot of people like it, physicians are doing it, all of that. But the big news for taxpayers is when you apply this to local government, Union County actually has done this, made direct primary care an option for their employees. And this year we'll anticipate seeing $1 million in savings to Union County budget. So imagine if we did this all over the state, imagine if we did it for state employees, imagine if we did it for Medicaid patients. Increased satisfaction, better satisfaction for patients and physicians, better access, and considerable cost savings.
And the bottom line, better health care.
Absolutely.
There's no question about it. That's an interesting, and many commercial companies, organizations are looking at this themselves. John, tell us something we don't know.
We talked about the UNC system earlier, and it's worth noting that even after the Great Recession and the budget constraints, North Carolina is the 4th in the country in state appropriations per student in university systems, 4th in the country, and the only large state that's anywhere close to the top.
Well, you've heard our spin on the issues of the day. To stay informed all during the week, give your feedback and read my weekly column. Visit our website, ncspin.com, or catch NC Spin on Facebook. Here's a programming note for you. Next week, and next week only, NC Spin will air on WRAL in Raleigh on Saturdays at Saturday night at 7:30 instead of our regular Sunday time. So join us for more balanced debate for the Old North State. Until then, stay informed and watch out for the spin.